So Per Lysaa, CTO and co-founder of Elevate Farms and CEO of Intravision Group, thank you so much for joining me on the Vertical Farming Podcast.
Thank you.
This is such a global show because of the nature of CEA, so I always like to start these conversations with letting the listener and the viewer know where in the world you're calling from, and probably evening for you now.
Sure, it is actually. Yes, I'm in Oslo,
Okay.
Norway right now. Yeah.
Were you born and raised there?
I was not born in Oslo, but I grew up on the west coast of Norway, which is the fjord country, which is kind of famous as a tourist
Yeah.
destination.
Do you get a lot of people visiting or having to take people to all the famous places that tourists like to see?
Yeah, I mean, especially the west coast and also the northern part is kind of very touristy, I would say, and we have a lot of cruise ships coming in the
Mm,
summer. Winter tourism have really grown the last decade, I would say, Northern
yeah,
Lights and all that stuff,
yeah.
obviously. And also, I mean, Oslo have really become quite a nice city the last 2 decades, I would say. We spent the oil money on something, so it's quite a nice spot now.
So we'll get into the work you're doing with Elevate Farms, which is relevant to this show. But prior to that, you've been working at Intravision. So for people to give a little bit of background as to what Intravision is and how it ties into the work you're doing at Elevate, can you talk a little bit about your background and how that got started?
I can do that. And basically, I'm running Intravision and Elevate are being run in
Yeah.
parallel. So Intravision being Elevate's tech supplier and science partner, basically. So, well, Elevate is more a large-scale farm
Okay.
operation. So more similar to what you would expect, yeah, plenty of aero
Yeah.
farms to do in that space. I can start, yeah. So I'm actually by education, I'm an
Okay.
architect. And back when I graduated in 91, there was a finance crisis. And I started actually a few years prior to work on a marine research
Mm,
institute, anything from shipbuilding, fast ferries, and fish in aquaculture. So when I graduated, I got my first job in this research institute, and I ended up being there for 7 years. And afterwards, I was basically hired to
mm,
innovate, to make new
okay.
stuff. That turns out I had a kind of a talent for applied physics and innovation and making things. So I guess that's my force. And so I normally say I never had a real job because after 7 years in that research institute, I was not an engineer and I was not an architect
Yeah.
anymore. So I basically started Intravision then back in 98 as a consequence of all these things. And quite early on, around 99, we secured a exclusive on what was back then a Norwegian tech company making colored light tubes. So red, blue, green colored light tubes, which had
Hmm.
longevity, so 50,000 hours or use hours. And we could computer control them, so we could dim the light and mix and make spectrum combinations. And I took this into two directions. One was photobiology.
Hmm.
So we started research projects both on fish in aquaculture, how to control the light-induced hormones, so melatonin, which again controls the rhythm. So when typically in aquaculture you want to have fish juveniles maybe 4 times a year. So we kept the fish in dark rooms and simulated the
Mm,
seasons so they would spawn at different
yeah.
points. And then more importantly, on the on-growing phase, we wanted to keep them in an eternal spring. So to avoid sexual maturation
Sure.
at all using light. And these things actually work. And then in parallel, we started with plants with the microalgae. So we built the photobioreactors to grow algae, and there were a few commercial endpoints we chased, but it was anything from astaxanthin, the red color in the
Yeah.
salmon, which is a feed component. We did green algae for live feed processes for fish, and then also we chased a sun protection agent, which were active in the UVA and blue light range, where people get the skin cancer. So I spent a decade on that. And then gradually from 2003 and onwards, we teamed up with a Dutch or a Philips owned company in
Hmm.
Holland. And we switched from light tubes to this. So I would say we're one of the early pioneers when it comes to kind of photobiology and LED light. And then gradually for since 2003, so more than 21 years now, we worked with LEDs in various kind of plant. Yeah. plant relations. So
There,
so that
there,
was
just there for a second. What were you seeing at the time? You know, because you're working in a lot of like the marine space in terms of like all the things that you were mentioning previously. When did you start to see, or were you always aware of what was happening in the controlled environment space as it relates to growing produce indoors? Is that something you were aware of at the time, or did you start to become more aware of it as you started to enter that space?
that happened
Okay.
later. When we started, I should mention though, the second avenue I followed with lights, where we basically we made large art installations.
Mm, okay.
So we had a completely different use where we made computer controlled art installations and actually made money on that back in the
Okay.
day. Anything from subway stations to bank headquarters and also public projects in especially Norway. We exhibited at the Shanghai Biennale in 2006. So we had these kind of two very different things from a perception point of view, but technologically they were almost the same. So we basically use the same tech and computer control systems in two very different ways. In 2003, when we started with LEDs, we started working with turf grass. And that was the first kind of land-based planting
Okay.
I touched. We basically did the research in the UK and in with Penn State University. So we had two different research avenues. The idea was to grow natural turf on football fields and uh, on golf greens. So I did test and pilot a bit with some of the US Open
Mm,
clubs and Augusta, and we also had a system at Green Bay Packers in
okay.
Wisconsin. That was a fun one because this was not done just light, it was an environment, a controlled environment. So we used the heat from the LEDs to control the climate just in the microclimate, 4 inches above the turf.
Mhm.
And the guys from Green Bay Packers said that they put the system out before Christmas and it started snowing. And when I came back after New Year, there was a rabbit family living under this really nice 20 Celsius
That's funny.
warm and with food growing there. So that was kind of a fun little story.
What was your experience of visiting the States and especially the Midwest? Weather-wise, it was probably similar because I live in Minnesota, which
Yeah,
is right
okay.
next door to
Yeah.
Wisconsin. So, and there's a lot of Scandinavians that live here that have migrated here many probably decades ago.
Yeah,
So
it
there's a
is. I
very
mean, I've been
Scandinavian
to
influence here.
40 some states and probably spent 2 years in America. I also lived a
Okay.
year in Chicago as an exchange student
Okay.
back in the day, in the early 80s.
Mm,
So no, I have a very kind
okay.
of nice
Okay.
relationship to America and also Canada, obviously. Basically, that was the
Yeah.
starting point, and then around 2008-9, we got funding for something called a Eurostar project, which is a European research program.
Okay.
And that was together with a company in Iceland called Orthgenetics. They used the GMO barley to produce human proteins, so cytokines, in the seeds of the barley. So,
Mhm.
and typically their customers would be a medicinal research project, stem cell, where you needed one isolated human protein to do some
Okay.
kind of research. And so we started on kind of venturing into this area of plant-made pharmaceuticals. That's kind of the label on this thing. And to make it very short, you can use a lot of different plants as long as they have the same kind of DNA structure as a human diploid. And then you can make big protein molecules. So there is a lot of research being done on cancer drugs, and there's a lot on vaccines. So the first time I guess this was successfully
Mhm.
demonstrated at scale was after the oh sorry I forgot the name. Was it the Ebola outbreak in Africa 8-9 years back? The Western
Yeah.
aid workers that came back to Europe
Yeah.
and America were saved using a tobacco infiltration system where you use transgenic tobacco plants and use them as a factory to grow the drug, basically. So the reason why we ventured into this space was
Okay.
that LEDs were still very expensive back then. When I started with LEDs in
Yeah.
2003-4, I would only get like 4 lumen per watt of light output on a blue LED. So that was 2003-4. In 2014, I got 40 lumen on the same energy. And the 2003 LED
Mm.
cost me $8 US, while by 14 it was $1, and then by 1920 it was 40 cents.
Wow.
And the light input have increased again. So Over the Intravision kind of journey here has been very much about tech maturity, and we were early, but we were also lucky in the sense that we managed to be part of or initiate a relatively large string of research projects. So we started making research equipment and sold that to different kind of institutions, mainly towards universities, but we also started supplying space research institutes in North America and also the European Space Agency.
Mm,
So we found a very small niche
okay.
where we could learn and develop basically. So through that project in Iceland, I used a Norwegian space research group to develop a remote control system. The workers in Iceland only were kind of greenhouse
Mhm.
workers. There were no scientists. So I used a Norwegian group. They remotely controlled from their office a unit at the International Space Station. That was kind of the triggered me. It was this very cool remote
Mm,
control thing they had. So they joined in and we developed this remote control for the
yeah.
system in Iceland. And then I asked them, so who is the leading environment or group in the world when it comes to making plans for human space travel? So I based on the moon or Mars. And they pointed me to the University of Guelph and Professor Mike Dixon there. So the short story is that Dixon was a postdoc at NASA in Kennedy, where they used to do all these things. He managed to get funding from the Canadian Space Agency to build his institute at the University of Guelph. That was around, must have been around
Mm,
2005, 6 ish, around there. So when the whole institute was built to answer one big question, is it possible to grow earth plants in a low atmospheric pressure? So imagine you are on Mars, it's a small planet, one third of gravitation field versus the Earth. And the question was, are the plants able to do the gas balance? Can they still catch the CO2 and do this whole photosynthesis process? So the Guelph facility
yeah.
has a unique chamber setup with, they call it hyperbaric research chambers. So they are vacuum chambers, and you can then take it down and mimic the gravitational field on the moon or on Mars, for example, and then test how this works. And the really nice thing for me was that when I started putting LEDs into these chambers and you close the door on a vacuum chamber, you need a really high fidelity instrumentation to understand
Yeah.
what happens inside and camera setups and all that stuff, obviously. You cannot open the door. So you need the sensor systems to work. And everything is like an isolated universe. No outside things
Mhm.
affecting what's happening inside the box. So when we dialed up more blue light, within 2 minutes, we could actually see how that affected the gas balance, if the plants would consume more CO2, release more moisture or oxygen, for example.
Mm,
So it gave us a very precise understanding on how plants interact with their environment. And that's kind of been key for both Intravision and Elevate and on how we afterwards then design the commercial systems.
was there anything as you were going through those and doing those experiments, was there anything about that process that was, like, surprising to you at the time? Or, you obviously need a high degree
Yeah.
of instrumentation and calibration to measure things at that level. So, maybe looking back, it makes sense, but I'm wondering, as you were going through that experience at the time, if there was anything that was really surprising for you?
I wouldn't say it was really surprising, but it was a very kind of happy moment when I understood what we could do with these things and
Mm,
how we could evolve by putting in more advanced LED systems. So we then started making very efficient, high intensity and multispectrum LED systems for the different chambers they have. So back around 2012, 13, we had a lamp with 5 times the intensity of the sun, half a meter inside the chamber on 7 different colors. So orange, purple, red, blue, green. We could use not to kind of grow plants at 10,000 micromole, which of course doesn't make any sense. The sunlight is 2,000 micromoles for reference.
okay.
But we could use it to mix different spectrums and start to learn more about how does the plant respond to this. And basically, I guess the key element here is that plants have light receptors. So they are able
Mhm.
to detect from far red through red, green, blue up to or to the UV. And whenever
Yeah.
they detect the combination of spectrum and intensity, sets off a chemical process in the plant that directly control morphology and what we call primary, secondary metabolite processes. So basically, the primary processes are growing and biomass and stuff like that, while the secondary is more the protection towards stress or environment or lack of water. And
Yeah.
some of these molecules the plant will then produce, we experience as tastes or medicine
Mm.
content, for example.
Mhm.
So it's a very fascinating world for us when we started getting these tools. And then the story, of course, is then tech transfer that the chambers we made our own research chamber. Around 2015, we built a cannabis research facility or room, at least, at one of the licensed producers in Canada. And the whole idea was to make consistent quality medicines from that.
Yeah.
But of course, as you know, the cannabis industry didn't have the patience to do that. So that's a different story.
Yeah, that's a different podcast.
Yeah, it's a different podcast. But anyways,
But I think what's the interesting takeaway there is it did give you the opportunity to, at least in the beginning, probably because of the investment coming into cannabis at the time, there was opportunities to test, some of these theories out and to see how some of these technologies were affecting, what you were able to do in a controlled environment.
yeah, you're absolutely right. We got a couple of
Yeah.
$1 million to play with to build toys.
Yeah.
We kept some of those toys so we could use them for other stuff. And then around 2015, we started working with another biotech or plant-made pharma company called Plantform Corporation. And
Mhm.
they are then using transgenic tobacco plants to produce drugs and vaccines. And to give you the short story, so in nature, there is this tobacco plant called the Nicotina bettaminiana, who lives in a
Mhm.
symbiosis with a agrobacteria. And in nature, that agrobacteria will insert itself into the roots of this tobacco plant and force the plant to produce a certain protein DNA. The GMO part is that the GMO this symbiosis to happen in the leaf structure.
As opposed to the root structure.
Yes, because then so
Okay.
it's in the leaf biomass. So the
Yeah.
way you do it is you grow this plant for roughly 4 weeks. You have a I don't know 18-inch tall tobacco plant, something like that. You then invert that plant upside down inside a vacuum chamber, suck out the air, dip the whole thing into a water solution where you have
Mm.
the agrobacterium with the DNA for the protein you want to make. And then you
Wow.
release vacuum and everything is sucked into the leaf. And while you grow the tobacco plant afterwards for roughly a week, the bacteria forces the plant to produce the drug or vaccine, so basically a big protein molecule. And there is a few companies in North America and Canada doing this. So, and it's a low cost to make drugs versus doing the big bioreactor systems, for example. So the idea that I've been working on is to, so back in the day, Platform were working with biosimilar Herceptin, which is a breast cancer drug women have to take after operation. But the cost point of that for one patient is roughly $35,000 a year. So
Wow.
that excludes the big portions of the world, right? And this approach was the roughly 10% of the cost on the production part. So the idea was to do this more less developed countries or less wealthy countries, basically. So, but yeah, so that was kind of so in order to do that, I needed to vacuum infiltrate tons of biomass every day. So and I needed to make a grow box, we call it, the one we grow the plants in, and I needed one which I can invert. So then we realized we had to actually grow the whole plant from seed in that box.
Mm.
And that was the starting point. The next thing we had to do was to come up with a grow system. And that became the system we patented and which Elevate is using. We name it the gravity flow. So
Okay.
basically, the gravity flow, imagine it's a very long rack, almost like a tunnel. And it has a
Yeah.
lift on one side feeding in the grow boxes. And then they just roll down through the system on gravity. And we extract them on the other side when the plants are ready for harvest. So
Mm.
it's a relatively highly automated system. And then we have very advanced light and air control inside that tunnel. So we always control the temperature and yeah, humidity and the light spectrum and everything. And we also track everything with RFID. So we always know where each box is in a system. So right now, we don't actually have anybody working inside the grow rooms.
It's all automated.
Yeah, it's all automated inside the grow room, only maintenance and sanitation and stuff like that, obviously. So all the workers are working on the start, so there's the seeding and getting that stuff, monitoring the transplantation and stuff, and then on the harvesting packaging side.
What were your thoughts as you were starting Elevate? Did you want to sort of prove this use case out, or did you feel that you then had the opportunity to begin, because of this patented system and the innovative way in which you were growing, there was a new opportunity to grow additional types of crops using this method?
Yeah, I would say it's a combo. We started around 2014 to supply LED lights to vertical farming,
Yeah.
and we teamed up with a few kind of companies. So we worked a lot with Zipgrow, which used to be, I guess, Bright Agriculture, which then became Plenty. So
Yeah.
we're an early, I would say, supplier into this industry, and we worked with a lot of the what became brand names. But the challenge was that all the clients, none of them actually had any IP, so they couldn't really scale.
Mhm.
So, and then since I'm an architect, I read a lot of stuff because obviously I don't know anything about almost most things. I read Peter Drucker, the guy who invented
Yeah.
the management theory and quality
Yeah.
management, and he said that the purpose of a business is the creation of customers. It's
Mm.
not about shareholder value or maximizing return on
Yeah.
investment. It's about creation of customers. So I decided,
Yeah.
well, if I can't find a big customer, I have to create one. And obviously, working with all these vertical farms, I met a lot of people. And then when I met my co-founder in Elevate, Amin Jadavi, I thought, let's give this one a chance and see. So we put the IP into what became Elevate for leafy greens. Amin used to run a paper tissue business. So when he was still in his 20s, he and a cousin, I think, took over the family business
Mhm.
and ran that for 15 years and sold it. And their clients was the US food service industry, companies like
Mm.
US Food, Cisco, the big ones.
Big distributors here. Yeah.
Yeah, I looked into the name numbers, and each of them make something like 9 times the food we consume in Norway. So it's hard to really imagine the scale, right? We're only 5 million people here. So anyway, so the idea we went for was then to do large quantities, high quality at commodity scale or at commodity pricing. So not super expensive micro or baby greens for a niche market, but
Yeah.
try to kind of get
Yeah.
the big volume. And we are able to do that. But of course, as anything else, there's a lot of challenges on actually getting that to roll. And one of the things we discovered, we built this Elevate facility in Orange, New Jersey, and we are able to do almost 200 kilo a square meter a year, which is 2-3 times what the competition can do. We
Wow.
really have high yield, but still, it's a small facility. So, in order to serve these big industry players, you need to have some impact. You need to replace trucks going from
Yeah.
Salinas or from Arizona. You can't give them 5 pallets, it has to be 5 trucks or something. And that's still in the works. We are looking at sites in Pennsylvania or for something big. And hopefully we'll get there soon.
What's been the biggest shift for you? Because, like you said, you come from an architecture background. Obviously, you have a mind for tackling engineering tasks. When you had to make the shift into business mindset, marketing mindset, all the things that Peter Drucker talks about, right? And just figuring out like what's the market for this. Obviously, partnering with someone who had experience in manufacturing was helpful.
Mm.
How much of a challenge was that for you to kind of make that shift in your mindset into realizing that you needed what got you here won't get you there is the saying, right? So, you had to change your way of thinking.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do consider myself being very privileged or lucky in a way. I mean, I've spent probably 2 years in Asia making stuff. I've spent 2 years in North America, Canada, selling and installing
Mhm.
stuff, and of course a lot
Yeah.
in Europe and the Middle East. So basically, all the tasks I have to do is a necessity to move things forward.
Yeah.
I get my kind of happiness or kick out of making stuff. So normally, when I did big art installations, I would say that there was 3 moments of profound happiness. It was when I got the idea, when I managed to sell it, and then
Yeah.
2.5 years later when I could see it actually in action. And it's a little bit the
That's great.
same with these systems we grow for plants because there is a lot of hard work and stuff you have to go through. And there's a lot of small and big crises you need to manage to get there. And you need
Yeah,
to deal with people, obviously. And I enjoy people. I
yeah,
mean, this wouldn't have worked if I didn't do that. And I would say most of my best friends are kind of the researchers and the people I have in the companies we work with. I'm a
yeah.
workaholic. There's no way of denying that.
Speaking of being a workaholic, you have your hands in 2 different businesses. Having a hand in one is a challenge for most CEOs. So how do you manage or how do you figure out the time you need to spend on Intravision versus the time you spend on Elevate? I'm curious about that because there's probably CEOs that are trying to wear multiple hats also that are listening, and I'm curious what your approach is,
Yeah, I'm only the CEO of Intravision. I'm not at an Elevate. I'm functioning, I would say, more like a CTO there.
which is still a big task.
Yeah, it's a big task, but I make the tech in one company and we use it in the other one. So, in my experience, most of the good ideas or good innovation we come up with are direct responses to some kind of need or challenge in kind of in either production or a customer need. We
Yeah,
spend a lot of time and energy on trying to kind of optimize the finished product for a specific task, optimize the process of how to make it. And we have the luxury that we basically go all the way. We try to control everything from the grow plug or the media or what it is, basically, to the way
yeah.
it's kind of harvested and packaged in the other end. So that's where we do a lot. We have a very good 15-year almost relation with the University of Guelph. I think that right now we have 9 students from PhD, master to undergrads working on different types of plants for us. And we cover anything from food to animal fodder to medicinal plants. So it's quite a range. And most of the biological research we do support will probably never end up in a product. But they are all kind of very important on the learning. And then we have quite a few future candidates which we do believe will end up as kind of products in some sense. And that's what I do for Elevate as well, right? I try to optimize the products and understand exactly how we can do the tech towards a certain scale of a market or yeah, whatever it is, basically.
What's a tough question you've had to ask yourself recently?
Tough question I have to ask myself. I'm not sure. I should probably spend more time on that, I guess, is the correct answer. No, but it's I'm getting older and yeah, it's building something when you start with one person and you do this organic and also because I control too many parts of the process. It's always challenging because in the starting point, of course, you are the driving force behind everything. But if you continue being that, you cannot grow. You
Yeah,
need to
yeah,
let go. You need to trust people. You need to, yeah. So that's probably where I'm failing the most, I would say. I either spend too
okay.
much time on it or I don't understand how to get more people quickly up to kind of a high
Yeah,
level. And then you, of course, you burn your fingers sometimes because you give people responsibility and
yeah.
they don't deliver. But I'm sure I could improve a lot on that. But we have a really good team though, and then, so I'm really proud of the team we have now. And it's very multinational
Mhm.
and it's quite young and it's very diversified.
Where are you seeing the most innovation happening in the controlled environment space?
That's a good question. I mean, if you look at the LEDs, the light sources, all the stuff we use there, it's kind of it's starting to become very mature.
Yeah,
I would say that I expect the much of the innovation to happen on the control sides, especially
mhm,
on the machine learning using cameras, and
yeah,
then towards more advanced AIs. I'm certain that's going to be a rapid development in the next 5 to 10 years. If I had the money, I could probably come up with 10 areas where we could really use a camera based machine learning today and then a more advanced AI in 3 years' time or something. But of course, again, I mean, every industry wants the same things, right? So there is a limited resources on good software people as well. So that's a competition there. But we are working over our own processes to get there. And it's about having a core team in house and partnering with the right groups, I think. We have very much a partnering structure. We partner with anything from universities to tech suppliers.
yeah,
We don't try to do everything. That's
that makes
impossible.
sense. On the Elevate Farms side, who is an ideal partner or a client for you? Where are you looking to develop relationships there?
So we focused on Central Europe and Switzerland, no, Switzerland basically, and on East Coast USA. That's kind of the two focus areas we have right now. And in both regions, we are aiming to build something big, 4 or 5 million kilos a
Mm,
year type
yeah,
operations. And we need to get there to have some
yeah,
impact. But again, we are also resource limited both on people and funds. So, I mean, we've been invited to a lot of projects in the Middle
yeah,
East, and none of them have kind of matured to anything of substance yet. But obviously, that's a big area to expand. If you look a little bit more into like the 10-year perspective,
mm,
we studied a lot on kind of available water resources for food production.
yeah,
And the projection is that around 2030, we have this from a publication in Nature, for example. We are facing a global water crisis which greatly will impact and disrupt how we make food on this
mm,
planet. And 2030 and onwards, it's going to look bad. And countries like Asia, Africa, parts of Europe, parts of North America
yeah,
are really badly positioned. And of course, as it always is, sadly, the rich countries will always manage to buy feed, right? So
yeah,
it's the poor people who don't get. So I do see that. I mean, we have in the research pipeline for the next 10 years, we have a 10-year
yeah,
pipeline. We do stuff like mint oil, for example. And the reason is that mint oil is used as a food taste additive, but it's used in Colgate
yeah,
toothpaste, it's used in chewing gum, everything basically. But the mint plant, which used to be grown a lot in America, has a fungus or virus in its
mm.
roots, which contaminates the soil you grow it in, and then you cannot continue growing it. So I think between Colgate and a few other big ones that consumed all the ground in North America now, they're down to the last 220 farms or something.
Wow.
So they moved us over to Southeast Asia, so
Yeah,
Vietnam, China, Sri Lanka, but that's not going to be
yeah,
sustainable. And of course, it's a very easy crop to move to a indoor system at scale.
yeah.
It's a relatively low height crop, so you can stack it in multi-layers, for example. So we're doing the research now. So at some point, I believe we will build really large systems to do that at scale because they will have to make more food, more rice, more staple foods in Asia to support the growing population.
It sounds like there's definitely a lot of opportunities there. What are you seeing? What's your perspective on your colleagues that are in the indoor farming space? What I like to do towards the end of these conversations is almost like create an open forum. I know there's always people that are worried about protecting all their IP and keeping everything house, but there has been some conversations about trying to find a way to collaborate, and that could look differently for different companies working on different projects. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts or for the CEA space, for your colleagues in this space, to foster that collaboration.
That's a good question. We have, yeah, it is as you said, so that there is a kind of certain element of competition,
Yeah,
which of course will make that a bit tricky maybe to arrange. But in honestly though, I mean, food is so enormous. And I don't know what vertical farming has managed to get to consume food in America, but if it's a tenth of a percent, I would be surprised. So reality, I guess, is that the disruption is happening regardless. When I started working with Algae back in 98, 9,
mm,
we had 385 ppm of CO2 in the air. And this year, I'm guessing it's around 416, 17. Pre-industrial revolution in UK, it was 180.
mm,
So global warming is
yeah,
happening, and there's no political ability or will to stop that.
yeah,
It's just going to continue. You can just see the new shift now in America where oil and coal will kind of really be come back. And of course, China, Russia, I mean, name a big country,
yeah,
and they're not able to do that. And I mean, you cannot expect the poor people not to eat. I mean, that's just the
yeah,
reality. So, in order to kind of better the planet by 2050, I believe we need 3 times more energy on the planet. because you cannot lift people out of poverty without giving them access to the modern media. They need internet, they need a platform to communicate, and they need to learn, right?
Mhm.
So if you consider that only at something like 15% of the energy we have today is sustainable, just imagine the shift you have to go if you have to make 3 times that energy in 30 years, and it all has to be sustainable.
Wow.
It's an immense task. And then we have the water thing. So ideally, we should all try to cooperate and share
Yeah.
learnings. I think it's probably the proper thing to do
Yeah.
for sure.
I think that's the common thread that we hear in these conversations. There's enough work for everyone, and that's what they call it here, the all hands on deck moment. Like, we just need everyone moving forward towards this goal, and everyone's doing it in their own way. But I really want to thank you for taking the time, and I really appreciate your team reaching out and connecting us, because it's hard for me to find everyone that's doing something in the CEA space, and especially what I consider you and the work you've been doing, a pioneer in the space. You've been doing it for so long, and you're innovating, creating IP, and I think I love the ability to tell these stories, because I don't know that a lot of people may know the work that you're doing and the innovation that you're creating. So I really appreciate this conversation, and I learned a lot, and I think it's going to be helpful for our listeners as well. So I appreciate you sharing that, your insights today.
Yeah, and thank you, Harry, for having me join.
Yeah.
So
Where's the best place for people to, listeners, to connect with you and to learn more about Elevate and Intravision?
we have both the Elevate and intravisiongroup.com and
Okay.
elevate.farm websites where there are contact potentials, mail addresses, and stuff like that.
Okay.
So
And I think
please, out.
yeah, your team
Yeah,
gave me those links, so we'll make sure we have those available for you as well, and we'll put those in the
yeah.
show notes. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.